The room was cold and bare, the kind of room a defeated army leaves behind when it runs out of places to retreat to. A captured German general stood near the center of it, his uniform still immaculate, his boots still polished, his bearing still that of a man who believed rank meant something no matter what flag flew over the building. And when the door opened and the Supreme Allied commander walked in, the German did the most natural thing in the world for an officer of his generation. He stepped forward and extended his hand. It was not a plea. It was not even, in his mind, a courtesy he had to earn. It was the reflex of a professional soldier greeting another professional soldier, the unspoken handshake between men who had each done their duty and now found themselves on opposite sides of a settled outcome. In a different war, the gesture would have been returned without a thought. But Dwight D. Eisenhower kept his hands at his sides, and the small frozen distance between that outstretched hand and the man who refused to take it would say more than any speech ever could. To understand why Eisenhower would not shake that hand, you have to understand the kind of man he was, because he was not Patton. He was not given to towering rages or theatrical gestures. He was a planner, a diplomat in uniform, a man who had spent the war holding together an alliance of proud nations and prickly generals through sheer patience and tact. He shook a great many hands. He posed for a great many photographs. He understood, better than almost anyone, that symbols matter, that a single gesture can be read by millions. And that was precisely why this handshake was one he would not give. By the time of this confrontation, Eisenhower had seen what the regime he was defeating had actually done. He had walked the grounds of a camp himself, deliberately, because he wanted to be able to say with his own authority that he had seen it. He famously insisted that the evidence be documented and witnessed, that reporters and lawmakers be brought in to look, because he understood with chilling foresight that one day people would try to claim it had never happened, that it had all been exaggerated or invented. He wanted witnesses. He wanted proof. He wanted the truth nailed down so firmly that no one could ever pry it loose. A man who has just stood in that kind of place does not easily clasp the hand of one of the senior officers of the system that built it. And here we should be honest about what we are describing, because the history matters. Not every German general was a willing architect of atrocity. Some were ordinary professional soldiers. Some privately despised the regime. And the question of guilt was tangled and individual. What follows is a dramatized retelling built on Eisenhower's documented attitudes and the realities of those final weeks, used to illuminate a real and important distinction. But the heart of it is true. Eisenhower drew a clear line between the soldiers he had fought and the cause they had served, and there were hands he would not take. So picture the general again, his hand still extended, the seconds stretching into something unbearable. Eisenhower did not take it. There was no shouting. That was not his way. He simply let the hand hang there in the cold air until its meaning curdled, until the German understood that the easy fellowship he had assumed between them did not exist and was not going to. The message was delivered not with violence, but with stillness. And in some ways, stillness was more devastating. A man can rage back against an insult. There is no answer to a quiet, deliberate refusal except the slow, sinking realization of what it means. What did it mean? It meant that Eisenhower was refusing to grant the comfortable fiction the gesture was built on. The handshake said, "We are the same, you and I, two soldiers caught up in something larger than ourselves." Eisenhower's refusal said, "No, we are not the same. I will accept your surrender. I will treat you according to the laws of war, because that is what separates my side from yours. But I will not pretend that we are brothers in arms, that what you served and what I served were merely two versions of the same honorable profession. They were not, and I will not let a handshake suggest otherwise." This is the quiet genius of what Eisenhower did, and why it has lingered in memory long after louder moments faded. He understood that the most dangerous lie the defeated regime could tell was the lie of equivalence, the idea that it had all just been politics, that the men in those uniforms were ordinary soldiers like any other. that with the war over, everyone could simply shake hands and move on, as though nothing unspeakable had occurred. A returned handshake at the top between the Supreme Commander and a captured general would have been a tiny brick in the wall of that lie. Eisenhower refused to lay it. Think about the discipline that required. Eisenhower was, by temperament and by job, a conciliator. His entire war had been an exercise in smoothing over conflict, in being gracious, in finding the diplomatic path. Every instinct he had spent years sharpening told him to be courteous, to ease the tension in the room, to take the hand and move things along. Refusing went against the grain of who he was, and that is exactly what made it meaningful. It was not a man indulging his temper. It was a man overriding his own deepest habits because he had decided that some principles matter more than manners. The contrast with how he treated others tells the rest of the story. Eisenhower was not cruel to his prisoners as a class. He was not a man who humiliated the weak for sport. Ordinary captured soldiers were processed and protected. The conciliator was still in there, still bound by the rules he believed in. But for the senior representatives of the regime, the men who had given the orders and won the trust of the leadership, he reserved a colder treatment, a refusal of the personal warmth that would have implied respect. He drew his line not at the bottom, among the conscripts, but at the top, among the men who could not claim they were only following orders because they were the ones who had given them. There is a lesson in that placement of the line. It would have been easy, in the white heat of victory, to despise every German, to treat the whole defeated nation as a single guilty mass. Eisenhower did not do that, and neither in their better moments did the Allies as a whole. The goal was never to crush a people. It was to hold the guilty accountable while leaving room for everyone else to rebuild and rejoin the civilized world. The refused handshake and the careful, lawful treatment of ordinary prisoners were two halves of the same idea. Justice aimed precisely, not vengeance sprayed wide. The general whose hand was refused would have understood in that moment that the world he had known was truly gone. Not just the war lost, not just the territory surrendered, but the entire framework of assumptions he had lived by. He had believed that a general was a general, that the brotherhood of arms transcended the particular cause. That honor was owed to rank, regardless of what that rank had been used to do. Eisenhower's stillness told him that this was no longer true, that the world had changed its mind about what honor meant and who could claim it, and that he was now on the wrong side of that judgment. And here is what makes the story resonate beyond that cold room. Eisenhower was, in that small gesture, helping to define the terms of the peace and of the memory that would follow. The decision not to treat the leaders of the regime as honorable equals flowed naturally into the great reckonings to come, the trials where those leaders would answer for their deeds before the law and the watching world. A handshake says the matter is personal and settled between gentlemen. A trial says the matter is public and must be judged by all of humanity. Eisenhower, by refusing the first, was pointing toward the second. It would be a mistake to imagine this was simple, or that every interaction in those chaotic days carried such clarity. The end of the war was a swirl of confusion, exhaustion, and improvisation. Lines were not always drawn so cleanly, and men did not always live up to their principles. But the instinct Eisenhower showed, the refusal to launder evil into mere rivalry, became one of the defining moral postures of the victory. It is the reason the Allied triumph is remembered not just as a military win, but as a moral one. They did not only defeat the regime, they refused to dignify it, even in the courtesies of its surrender. Consider, too, what the handshake meant to the man offering it, because that reveals the worldview Eisenhower was rejecting. To that general, the gesture was almost certainly sincere, and that sincerity is the most unsettling part. He genuinely seemed to believe he was entitled to it. He had compartmentalized whatever he knew, told himself he was a soldier doing a soldier's work, and walked into that room expecting the professional courtesy he had always received. He could not see, or would not see, that the cause he had served had forfeited that courtesy entirely. Eisenhower's refusal was, in a sense, an attempt to force him to see it, to confront the reality that no clean professional identity could survive contact with what had been done. The men who served the regime wanted, more than almost anything, to be remembered as soldiers, and not as something worse. They clung to the uniform, the rank, the rituals, because those things promised a kind of honorable anonymity, a way to disappear into the vast, blameless category of men who simply fought for their country. Eisenhower would not grant them that disguise. By refusing the handshake, he was refusing to let a senior officer hide inside the comfortable identity of the honorable soldier. He was insisting that the man stand exposed as exactly what he was, an agent of a cause that had placed itself beyond the protections that honor normally provides. And so the small moment carries the weight of the whole war's meaning, a hand extended in the old familiar gesture of soldierly respect, a hand quietly, firmly refused. In that refusal lived an entire judgment, the judgment that some causes are so corrupt that serving them at the highest levels strips a man of the courtesies he would otherwise be owed, not his life, not his legal rights, not the protections of a prisoner, but the warmth, the respect, the brotherhood, the handshake. Those, Eisenhower decided, had to be earned, and they could not be earned in the service of what that general had served. What stays with us all these years later is how much can be said without a single word. Eisenhower did not lecture the man. He did not need to. He simply declined to perform the one small act that would have implied they were equals, and in declining, he said everything. He reminded the world that manners are not the same as morals, that there are moments when the most principled thing a person can do is to withhold a courtesy, and that the way we treat the powerful in their moment of defeat reveals exactly what we believe. So remember the cold room and the outstretched hand. Remember the general who assumed that rank would shield him from judgment, and the commander who quietly refused to let it. It was not the loudest moment of the war, not by far, but in its stillness it held a truth worth carrying. Honor is not a uniform you put on. It is not a rank you are handed. It is something you either earn or forfeit by what you choose to serve. And there are hands, history reminds us, that a decent person simply will not shake.